皆さん、こんにちは。お元気ですか？ So last time we did 朝ごはんを食べて、シャワーを浴びて、会社へ行きます。Take form. Then you can express a routine. For example, 朝ごはん, the breakfast. So in the morning, you eat breakfast, ごはん, 朝ごはん, right? For example, at 7:30. Then take a shower at 8:30, right? And go to your workplace, which is 9 a.m. So this is not specifically, eating breakfast, then take a shower, then go to a workplace. Doesn't mean you do that. You do all of things in continued time, right? You can specifically pick up something you did, then. This is this grammar, okay? 朝ごはんを食べて、シャワーを浴びて、会社へ行きます。Okay, this is the last time we did. And today we're gonna be doing this. 勉強が終わってから友達と食事しました。So, this is also te form. 終わって、勉強。勉強 study, to study. In Japanese, this is noun, study. 勉強が終わってから、勉強が終わってから友達と食事しました。しました。It's a past form, right? 友達と食事しました。We are learning this. We are doing this. 勉強 after you done studying, 食事 is meal, noun, but do meal, which is you had a meal. Had, okay? And しました with who? With your friends. Friend? A friend or friends? We don't know. We don't use plural. So, a friend or friends. 勉強が終わってから友達と食事しました。We're learning this today. Okay, so you just gotta replace here a noun with who, your friend's name or mother, father. It's your choice. And did what? For example, if you replace this 勉強 study to other noun 仕事 work or job, so after you done working 友達と食事しました You had a meal with a friend. Another example 宿題が終わってから友達と食事しました。宿題 is homework. So, after... So, let's say you're speaking this phrase. Then, after you done doing homework, you had a meal with a friend. Making sense. So, so this part, 終わってから after you done something, you add this something before this 終わってからが終わってから then 友達と食事しました This is what you did after you done something. So you can replace anything in this part. For example, 宿題が終わってから友達と遊びに行きました。After you're done doing homeworking, I went to hang out with your friend. Or you can replace anything. For example, after you're done working, 飲みに行きました。Go grab a drink. With who? 同僚、coworkers, colleagues. 仕事が終わってから同僚と飲みに行きました。Is this happening a lot to you? So, 仕事が終わってから同僚と飲みに行きました。So this grammar basically, you tell somebody that you've done something before this phrase. 同僚と飲みに行きました。You went to go grab a drink with your colleagues. Before that, you've done something. You've done something. 終わってから. And what? Something. Okay. So, now you've got where to replace words. And where should keep. Okay. が終わってから. You've done something. So, let's make a sentence. You can comment down below and let me know what you thought, what you made, how you built the sentence. Let me know in the comments and I'll check it out. Okay, so from here, let's use this grammar practically. So, let's say we're in a meeting room, then 座ります、話します。You use te form to express something you've done. 座ります. So 座ります is group 1. So you eliminate this the and attach て座ってから話します。座ってから話します。After we've take a seat, then talk or speak or have a conversation. 座ってから話します。So, first you do this. 座って which is to take a seat or sit. 話します。Then talk. Okay? So, after this kara, you can use any aspect of the time. For example, past tense or present tense or future tense. But before that, before this number 2, there is a number 1. So what you did, number 1, is past tense. 座って or present tense, future tense. We don't know. It depends on the context. But 座ってから. Then you do something or you did something at number 1. Then do this, number 2. Then. Okay? So this time spectrum is continued. So last time, て、right? So 私は朝ご飯を食べてシャワーを浴びてそれから会社へ行きます。It's not specifically continued like, for example, number 1 is 8:30. 座って to take a seat or sit down. Then 話します。At 8:30, you take a seat. At 8:31, you talk. から。This is a spectrum, right? It's continued. If the time flows to number 2, right? From the time flows from number 1 to number 2. Okay, this is the grammar. This is this grammar, okay? 座ってから話します。So, 帰ります is group 1. So this is also eliminate be and attach. で、帰ってから what you do after you go home. 帰ってからご飯を食べます。After you went home, then you eat, for example, dinner or lunch or breakfast. You don't know because gohan is meal. Sometimes rice, but we say gohan a lot instead of saying breakfast or lunch or dinner. 朝ごはん、昼ごはん、夜ごはん。We say just ごはん meal. 帰ってからご飯を食べます。And another example, can you guess? 飲みます。This is also group 1. So, group 1, eliminate me and attach んで, right? So, 飲みます。飲んで。飲んでから。飲んでから。寝ます。Drink something, then go to bed. So what do you drink? What do you drink before you go to bed? For me, 薬を飲んでから寝ます。Take a pill or medicine. 薬を飲んでから寝ます。We say 飲みます。薬を飲みます。Take a pill, take a medicine. In English, you say that take, but we say swallow or drink a medicine or pill. 薬を飲んでから寝ます。I take a sleeping pill every day, then go to bed. So, 薬を飲んでから寝ます。For you, maybe ビールを飲んでから寝ます。You drink a glass of beer, then go to bed. Okay, so you're getting at this. So first verb conjugate into te form for mas form, then attach kara after this te form, then what you do or what you did. Add more information. Then you can use this grammar. Alright, so if you have any questions, you can also comment down below as well. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video. ありがとう。